Inside this Kenner building, Jefferson Parish 6th Justice of the Peace Kevin Santani handled over 60 eviction cases last week. Not uncommon for this longtime elected Justice of the Peace, who handles small claims matters in Kenner and Metairie. Things like auto repossessions, evictions, and neighborhood feuds. He can even perform weddings. Financial disclosure forms filed with the state show that Santani earned over $147,000 in 2023. And while some may find that high for a part-time judge, he's far from the highest paid Justice of the Peace in Jefferson Parish. West Bank-based Justice of the Peace Vernon Wiltie III took in over $225,000 that same year in compensation, and Metairie-based Justice Charles Chuck Cusimano took home over $345,000. By comparison, that's more than Governor Jeff Landry and Texas Governor Greg Abbott make combined.
I think we should look at it all.
State Representative Jerome Zarang from Houma is leading the charge at the state capitol, pushing to examine how much all state judges are paid and what they do. And that includes justices of the peace who are small claims court judges, and their attached constables who are also elected and work as the law enforcement arm of the justices of the peace, serving evictions and notices.
Justice of the Peaces and others, at a certain time, they had an important role and responsibility. I think now with improvements in technology and other things that there are probably opportunities that we can reduce that, and there is no doubt that in some cases they're making a heck of a lot of money.
And almost all the money paid to justices of the peace and their attached constables comes from filing fees. Little to no state or parish money is actually used. Take Cusimano. Records show he collected just about $21,000 as a salary from Jefferson Parish, but he made an additional $327,000 from fees. That's because his Metairie-based district has a large population, a lot of apartment complexes, and numerous auto dealerships. So the filings are high, meaning more fees and a larger take-home compensation. But not all justices of the peace and constable districts are like that. There are almost 800 statewide. Many make part-time salaries for part-time work. It all comes down to the geography. The larger the district, the bigger the population, and the more filing fees. There is a Louisiana Justice of the Peace and Constable Association. The president telling WDSU Investigates, the Louisiana Justice of the Peace courts serve to legally, equitably, timely, and fairly resolve the public's civil small claims and occupancy justice issues with ease, affordability, and self-represented access, as well as providing criminal magistrate services to promote the peace and tranquility in the community in accordance with Louisiana law and Supreme Court Code of Judicial Conduct. These courts operate their civil jurisdiction by self-generated court cost with little, if any, other outside government funding.
And you have some districts where, frankly, they're not doing hardly anything.
Zarang says a look at this by the legislature is on the horizon.
And they make a lot of money, and also some of the things that they can do and their responsibilities could be handled by locals, either through the sheriff's office or other circuit courts or district courts, or even within the city courts as well, that I think that can be handled, that could offset that and reduce the need for having those.
The Public Affairs Research Council of Louisiana, or PAR, an independent watchdog group, supports Zarang's idea to examine justices of the peace and constables.
I would like to know how ubiquitous that is across the state. Are these just anomalies in some high population areas? What is going on with that? I think this definitely needs to be looked at. I'm not saying that I have a particular solution right now, but I think the first step is finding out what's going on.
The Justices of the Peace and Constables Association says it's an open book, adding, while there is always room for improvement, the nearly 800 Justices of the Peace and Constables throughout the state stand ready to work with all branches of state government to increase their tremendous value and assist directly to the public, businesses, and other government entities.
And I think we do need to look at it, and I think there are things that we can do that can create some efficiencies.
For WDSU Investigates, I'm Travers Mackle, WDSU News.
And all justices of the peace and constables file annual financial audits with the state legislative auditor, and they must disclose their income. All of the elected justices of the peace and constables mentioned in this report did that following every letter of the law. Many tell us they work full-time hours and sign arrest warrants at all hours to help law enforcement.